and trainees and trainers from the point of view of us all being people, and what is going on around us in our daily life, in our local life, in our national life, affects us as professionals, affects us as people, and affects us, I think, professionally. And what one shouldn't forget, of course, is that it affects our students also. So we're all part of a whole. And what we talked about in April was how the past, the present, and the future affect us from the point of view of training, of teaching, resources, and materials. Because what we actually do and what we use has to be relevant to the reality in which we're teaching, learning, training in. So this is a little bit of revision going back to last April. My memory isn't wonderful, but I found the slides from it. So what we talked about in April was the changes and similarities between what people were doing then and what they'd done up to that, in the run up to that. How had professional life changed? Obviously, at that point, most schools, both in Poland and here, were in lockdown. Certainly here, no kids were going to school in April last year. And as a professional, that has a huge impact on all of us. And each of you will know from your own point of view how it affected you personally from a professional point of view. What was teaching online like for you? And I found it interesting to talk to people, teachers, some of whom said, actually, do you know what? I actually really rather enjoyed it. And others saying, oh no, it was an absolute nightmare. I can't wait to get back into the classroom. I think I'm probably in between the two. But we talked quite a bit about the changes professionally that everybody had to put up with or make use of in the preceding 12 months. And we talked about professional changes, but also we talked about personal changes, because again, and I have to admit, I can't remember exactly how you reported life in your different bits of Poland then, but from my point of view, as was said at the beginning, I live in a small provincial town in Scotland, about halfway up Scotland, equidistant from Glasgow and Edinburgh, if you can imagine the map. It's 3,500 people here. It's at the beginning of quite beautiful countryside. It's where rivers and lochs and small mountains, big hills exist. So it depends on tourism. It depends on people coming here. Like many small towns, it's quite inward looking. I mean, that's one of the more negative features about it. But for a small town that depends on tourism, and where some of the population commute to either Glasgow or Edinburgh or much nearer Stirling to work, the fact that one couldn't move around, the fact that you couldn't do all the things that you do automatically, was having a great effect on people. And I noticed some people getting quite aggressive. I don't know if it was like that where you live, but some people really were getting quite aggressive. The chats that were going on Facebook were, some of them not actually very nice. So I think that was one of the pressures on all of us as people, as opposed to professionals. And please do post things in the chat as we go along if you disagree with anything. So the way I ended the April session was asking people to think forward. Sitting in April 2021, and looking ahead, asking people to do a projection of this year, next year, about themselves, both personally and professionally, about what might change, the good things to keep from what had happened, and the difficult things. What are the positive and negative things? And also to think whether there were any unexpected benefits, and what from the learning process of having gone through the COVID pandemic, what would people hope to carry forward to your life and work next year? And now, of course, we're actually in next year. So the fact that I ended up the very last slide in April 2021 was asking about the future and April 2022 from the point of view of people. Now, I don't know, I've thrown a lot of backward thinking in a sense at you. If anybody would like to comment in the chat, please do, and I'll give you a little pause, because I know it's quite tiring listening to a voice for a long time. So any thoughts about the past? Oh, that's very nice. It starts off with a positive one from Willow. I found that I really enjoyed teaching online for the first time. That's interesting. Was that because there was no alternative, that it was a good thing to enjoy it? Was there a reason for enjoying it? Yeah, I agree, Joanna. It gave us unique experiences. I think for all of us, as in our different ways as people. When I started thinking back when I was preparing this talk, you know, I was amazed how my life had changed over the last almost 2 years. Made us tech friendly, yes. I think that some people were tech nervous at the beginning, and then other people were not nervous at the beginning, but actually all of us have had to cope with it and have actually found that it can be very useful, can be very positive. And that, in a sense, is a plus for all of us. Okay. Okay, worked well for some students. Now, that I'm really glad that you've mentioned the students, because it's awfully easy as a teacher to talk as a teacher. And it's why I keep using the word people, because our students as people have been affected as people in exactly the same way that we have, good things, bad things. And from their professional point of view, as learners, as students, they weren't in control. They were in a situation, as we were as professional teachers, where their learning had to be done differently. And for some of them, I think, that was positive. For some of them, very boring, not having the social, personal contact. For some of them, a challenge. You know your students, obviously, better than anybody else does. And so there've been positive and negative things for them. And maybe if you're talking with your students at the beginning of this year, I know that the term, the semester has already begun, and certainly if you're training teachers, it might be interesting and illuminating to ask them about positive and negative things, both professionally and privately, personally. I was just looking at the language correction of practice with a C or practice with an S. One of my nightmares was one of the things I've done professionally is work quite a lot with teachers in Latin America, above all in Brazil, but also a bit in Mexico. And there, of course, it's American English. And one of the problems for a native British English speaker is the minute you write anything, you have to double check because it looks okay to me, but it doesn't look okay to them. So practice with a C or practice with an S is an absolute nightmare. I agree. I'm happy with both. Okay, let's move on. Let's look to the present. Here we are on the 12th of January, 2022. Can you remember what you were doing 2 years ago, the 12th of January, 2020? Take just a couple of minutes to think about it. That was probably about the last bit of so-called normal times. I'll tell you what I was doing. I just come back from Christmas and New Year in Venice. I used to live and work in Venice. I used to teach in Venice, and I have a lot of friends there and family, and I love it. I just come back and I was thinking ahead to the rest of 2020, and on my calendar in the spring was Visit Poland. And we've just been chatting about it. I was going to do a nice tour of, from memory, Warsaw, Wrocław, and somewhere else, I can't remember. And this was going to be in March. And as we got closer to that date in spring 2020, I started getting emails saying, oh, Susan, we think there might be a problem. We're not sure we can have visitors, and we're not sure we can have foreign visitors in the university or with the teachers group and so on. And somebody's remembered the event sadly was cancelled. And I actually I felt very, very sad about it because I was really looking forward to coming to meet some of you again, make new friends. I was coming by car. Those of you who know me well, I know it's not very green, but I actually love driving because you're in control. You can go where you want, you can change your mind, and so on. So I'd worked out the route. I'd got books in the car. I'd booked the ferry because one of the easiest ways of getting from Scotland to the continent is on a night ferry, which is a very nice way of beginning a trip. And I booked it, and then I got the final email saying, Susan, sorry, it's cancelled. They're all cancelled. Basically, the subtext was, don't come. And I thought, oh, what do I do? Well, I booked the ferry, so I won't go to Poland. I can still go to France, where I have friends. So I actually had a sort of holiday, thanks to COVID, in March. But that was an example of plans being totally turned on their head. And, you know, being a fairly optimistic person, I was thinking, oh, well, if I can't go now, this will all be over by the autumn, so I can come to the conference in September. And then obviously, that's 18 months ago, and you know as well as me that these things haven't happened. So 12th of January 2020, you know hopefully what you were doing. Sorry, I'm just playing with my... Right, then last year, the 12th of January 2021, that was really awful because here everything was locked down. Scotland has been much strict, even has been stricter than England about that. We couldn't have more than one person, not of the family, in the house at one time. So, you know, that was a fairly dismal period. And just for fun, think about now, the 12th of January 2022, what can we do, what can't we do, and what do we hope, what do we think we might be able to do this time next year? And that gives us a kind of time frame, a 3-4 year time scale to think within. And I thought I'd remind you of some of the things that have changed in terms of language and communication because of what has happened. And these are some photographs, some of which I think I may have used in April. They're photographs I've taken in the little town where I live, of the signs that went up. And some of them use language which I would never have expected to find in my own environment, in my own English-speaking environment, before the pandemic. I mean, social distancing, I would have known, we would all have known what it meant, but it didn't exist as a fact that you had to keep 1 to 2 meters away from people. The idea that there should be a maximum number of people in a shop at any time, and that there should be one way round with a supermarket, a large shop, would never have crossed our minds. And quite interestingly, last weekend, I went round the same places, the same shops in the town, to see how much had changed. And I was actually amazed how many of the same signs were there. So, you know, things haven't eased up very much. More social distancing signs, more one-way system. The mention of mask. Now, I said I have lived and worked in Venice, and some of you will know that Venice is famous for a carnival, and during carnival people wear masks, but very different from the masks we're all wearing now. So 2 years ago, if somebody had said to me a mask, the word mask, what would have come to my mind was Venice, Commedia dell'arte, masks that were sort of fun or linked to a positive way of spending an evening at the theatre. Now, a mask is part of everyday life. I don't know if it is for you still, but here in Scotland, we have to wear a mask on public transport. So if you go on a bus or a train, you must wear a mask. In a shop, it's not the same in England, but here in Scotland, you have to still wear a mask in a shop, in any enclosed space, and so on. So masks have become a part of everyday life. And every now and again, I go out to go to a shop or get on a bus, and I think, oh, blast, I've left my mask at home, you know, and I have to go and find another one or buy another one or something. So behavior, the way we present ourselves has changed incredibly. Some communication was very, very wordy, people trying to explain why you had to do things. Some of it was very direct. I think it's a very good visual image. Joanna, so people are ignoring the regulation. Yes, there's another difference, a bit like that, between Scotland and England. Here, actually, people are, well, certainly here in Callander, they are pretty good at obeying it. But friends in England tell me that, on the whole, people ignore it a lot. So here we've got behavior, people's behavior coming into how we go about our daily life, and maybe that's something that one can look at from a language point of view. That was another example of the mask and shops. Anxious to sell them, but saying that contributions from sale go to National Health Service charities, so making things look a bit better. Okay, so that was the sort of visual world that we've got used to, which 2 years ago, I don't think any of us would have dreamt about. I don't think we would have envisaged. And again, just looking back for another moment or two, this is a question I used in April. Can you remember how you first heard about COVID-19 and how it changed your daily life? I won't ask you to answer here, but it's quite a salutary thing, and it's quite an interesting thing to do with students. I find I did it with a group of Brazilian students, in fact, online, and they were obviously, from a cross-cultural point of view, quite interested, or they appeared to be, how the changes they'd had to put up with in their daily life were actually very similar to the ones that I did. So that's something that could be a topic of conversation, exploitation, and so on. And then what about you? How did you adapt? And what did you learn from doing so? Going back to the comment about doing things digitally online, some people, I think, have been surprised at the way they can cope with teaching online, that there are pluses as well as minuses, and that technically, maybe it's been good for all of us to have to learn new skills or improve the skills that we already had. And again, the same goes for our students. And then the third question was how normal work has changed, and at a time when there are no restrictions, what aspects of the change in normal work would you want to keep? Would you want to go on, if you're allowed to, in your teaching context? Would you want to go on teaching online? Would your students want to go on learning online? And if so, how would this affect the content of what was done in the classroom? So I think anybody involved in course planning or materials writing or administration needs to think about that. Don't suddenly just go back to where things were 2 years ago. What are the pluses? What are the minuses that can be taken forward and as a way of benefiting from what we've been through? And so again, summing up, personal changes and similarities. Where do you teach? Where do things in the outside world affect your daily life? And what are the positives and negatives? And similarly, professionally, where do you teach? What are the priorities and what are the positives and negative? So, enough of the past. Life and language, language and life. What I thought I'd do is take 5 aspects of what I perceive as possible changes and things that maybe we can benefit from for the future, or are at least worth thinking about. Now, in those slides, the photos I showed you, we had examples of language, stay safe, wear a mask, only 2 people, etc., etc. And language is the obvious thing that has changed. It's changed enormously in English, and I'd like to ask you whether language has changed in Poland as well. Quite by chance, by lucky chance, 2 or 3 days ago, a week ago, I was sent something called English in a Time of COVID. Now, some of you, I'm sure, because I know that Hugh has participated in IATEFL Poland events, you know the name of Hugh Deller and Andrew Walkley. And as is said here, they found that over the last 2 years, COVID-19 has come to dominate many of our conversations. In our lexical lab classes, it crops up week in, week out, no matter what other topics we're looking at. As we enter the 3rd year of the pandemic, we've put together a collection of some of the things we've taught around the topic. And this is the interesting bit, we'll be offering free copies to anyone signing up to our mailing list, but wanted first to offer you, our loyal followers, because I'm on their mailing list, your own copy here. We hope you find plenty to interest you there, and it helps you both talk more about the ongoing situation and help any students you have who might want to do the same. So I know, I don't know Andrew very well, but I've known Hugh for years. And so I mailed him to say I was going to do this session with you, and would he agree to my showing some of the language that they had come up with on screen. And he said, yes, of course. And it is in the references at the end. But if anybody wants a copy of this, and I find it fascinating, if you go to their website and sign on, you get a free copy sent to you. And this is an example of the kind of language showing how language is moving, how English has been moving based on real life examples. And some of it is taking ordinary language and putting it into a different context. So in bed with COVID, you could be in bed with flu, you could be in bed with measles, you could be in bed with all sorts of things, but laid up with, down with, very much used. Asymptomatic, self-isolating, self-isolate. I mean, this because of the rules here, if you test positive, you have to self-isolate here now. I think at the moment it's 5 days. It keeps changing. I don't know about Poland whether your rules change from day to day, but it's quite a nightmare keeping up with them here. So interesting examples of real life language, which you might find useful to feed into whatever it is you're doing with students at the appropriate level, and find out if the same thing is happening with Polish. Here we've got vaccines, a lot of discussion, certainly on social media here, pro and anti-vaccinations. The anti-vaxxers, that phrase didn't exist until before 2 years ago. The anti-vaxxers, people who think it's wrong to have forced vaccination, being very vociferous in social media, others not agreeing. Discussions within families about whether it's right that people should be vaccinated or have to be vaccinated to go to a soccer match or go to a nightclub, even go to school. So the debate and the strong feelings have thrown up a lot of different uses of language, things like there's been all this fuss about, and so on. And lockdowns and restrictions, again, a lot of discussion, real life examples of how we've all become more conscious of the restrictions on what we can do, what we want to do. A friend of mine said, it's a bit like when you get in your car, if you pass your test, the things that you can do and you can't do for driving. Well, actually now it's about life too, the things that you can do and you can't do. Slight oversimplification. But anyway, as I say, I've put the reference at the end, and I think that you might find a copy of this based on real life, authentic language, and knowing Hugh and Andrew very much from a lexical point of view, not a grammatical one. You might find this interesting to look at and think about. If anybody wants to comment on any of this or ask any questions, do post away. Okay, so my first thought about language, especially dominated by the changes in life, is that it's moving, it's developing. Of course, language moves and develops all the time, but it's going more quickly because of the way that life has been developing. Right. So the second one was climate change. Now, you might wonder, what on earth has this got to do with COVID? It's got nothing to do with COVID, or at least the way the reason for bringing it in has nothing to do with COVID. In September last year, so four months ago, the high school here, which is for kids for 11 to 18, I got a message to say that there was a group in the penultimate year, so 16, 17-year-olds, were absolutely passionate about climate change and the likely effect of it on them and their lives. So if you can think of 16, 17-year-olds at upper secondary school. The reason I think that gave a context to this concern was, as I said at the beginning, this town, Callander, is equidistant between Edinburgh and Glasgow. And you might remember that in September this year in Glasgow, there was a COP conference, big international conference. And so climate change was obviously on the radar. You couldn't open a newspaper here without hearing about climate change. And the same for radio and same for television. So one of the teachers, modern studies teacher at the local high school, thought it would be useful for his students to be able to hear what other people in the community, older people in the community, adults, thought about this thing that they were so concerned about. So he set up a panel, a board, in the local place, which has a big room. The reason I was gesticulating is it's just opposite my house across the road. And he invited people from various local organizations, the local council, and I'm not quite sure why I was invited, but anyway, I was there to be on a panel to answer the questions that these teenagers had come up with. And these are the 8 questions that I think there were 5 of them, 5 adolescents put to us. And I found them illuminating, some of them quite difficult to answer publicly. I find them illuminating as an insight into the kind of concerns that adolescents have. And, some of them you can say they might be a bit silly or they're just fashionable, but it's an insight into how some adolescents think. And I think as a teacher, maybe as a parent, but certainly as a teacher, sometimes it's quite difficult to kind of get inside our students' minds. And I think if we're in the process of selecting material for them, finding activities for them, the more you can understand about what their concerns are, nothing to do with English in a sense, but what their concerns are as people, then I think it helps us to choose the right kind of activities, productive activities for them. So I thought you might be quite interested to see these. And the one I liked very much was, it was slightly male-dominated group of students, but there was a very articulated girl there. Given the need to cut carbon emissions from travel, should I be bothering to learn to drive? And that's actually a very realistic question, because as I said, this is a small town. It's got the most dreadful bus service, which they keep cutting. And if you want to go anywhere, and certainly if you're 17 years of age and you want to go anywhere in the evening, it would be nice to be able to drive. So one of the things I felt was useful was that there was a bridge between the political stuff, what was going on down the road in Glasgow with international people from all over the world, and the reality in which these students are living. And what I did, one of the things I do from time to time, as well as talking to you online, I do write an article quite regularly for the teacher magazine, the Polish Teachers magazine. And I used this, one of my problems, because I'm not sure if Patrick is here. He said he might try and come along. One of my problems is thinking of something useful or interesting to write about every 2 months. And I thought that this could be an interesting idea for a project, possibly for teachers, to read what the British students, the Scottish students had written, take their questions, perhaps use the questions with your students, their students, to provide answers, and then possibly send the answers to the students here. And that offer is still open. And then I thought, you know, maybe if climate change is of interest to your students, and the reason I'm saying adolescents, because I think it's adolescents who are most concerned, but there are a lot of adults too. What local or worldwide concerns do other people have? Do your students have? What questions would they ask in a conference? Ask from their ideas. And are their concerns local or international? And to what extent are concerns affected by age, future hopes, and current reality? So this is a possibility of using wide concerns in the language classroom as a medium of communication and discussion. And what I also put in the article, I quoted what Greta Thunberg had commented on about the politicians' speeches at the Youth for Climate conference in Milan, which was just before the one in Glasgow, because I think it was, it's quite fun. Build back better, blah, 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 green economy, blah, 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 net zero by 2050, blah, blah, blah. And as I said, words can convey powerful feelings as well as facts. How else could you express this feeling? And one of the things I think that's difficult in the language classroom is we tend to focus obviously on more formal language. But you know, here is something said by a teenager to other teenagers, and you can approve or disapprove of it. But I thought it was quite an interesting use of English. Okay, the next one was projects, and really thinking following that climate change panel. This sent me back to projects. I've been a great supporter of project work for years and years and years and years. I think most of the things I've ever written or been involved in have involved project work. I know they're difficult. I know there are all sorts of problems concerned with them. But it seems to me at this point in time, because of the way language and life are changing, have been changing, maybe this is a good point in time to revisit projects. And I, again, this is taken from an article in The Teacher. It seems to me that the potential outcomes of projects, if they're well done, well planned, are they link the classroom and the outside world. And of course, one of the great pluses of students being able to access things digitally is they can find information and examples that they can't necessarily find in textbooks and so on. They can build self-confidence. They help identify and use individual interests and skills. They provide opportunities for organizational skills. If you've got a project where you've got a group of students working together, you know, they've got to organize themselves. They've got to know who's doing what. They've got to know how to present things. And they're using language for a real reason and with an education outcome. So certainly from a training course point of view, projects is something that I tend to spend quite a lot of time discussing. And that's really a rerun of the previous file. And this is something I think I'm probably going to come back to for my next article in The Teacher. I want to revisit projects. And what I think is very important in making projects successful is that you think through the timeline, you think through the schedule, you give it a structure, and the students all understand this. So you've got to get it started and be clear about the aim. You've got to monitor it. you have to find out if the group are really working together properly. They've got to find a way of putting the individual bits of work together and sharing it and being evaluating each other. So projects in terms of life, but also obviously involving language, to me are a very, very productive activity to use in the classroom, but they do need a lot of thought. The ones that are a disaster, I think, are where a teacher goes in with, it's a great idea, but they haven't thought it through and it goes wrong, and that puts them off projects forever, which is a pity. And the almost final one, training courses. A question I would want to think about if I was involved in training teachers would be, what would you want as a participant? What would you want an online training course to provide for you? Is it facts? Is it examples? Is it inspiration? How would that be different from a course in the past and my usual thing of similarities and differences? And again, I referred, I think, last April to an online course set up by the Sol organization based here in the UK, but very active in Poland and Central Europe countries generally, last November, so November 2020, that's right. So just over a year ago, setting up an online discussion forum for teachers from the various countries. And what was very interesting was that Peter Medgyes and I actually were invited to start it off, to open the first session. And as you can imagine, when you're dealing with an audience you don't know, and you don't know what they want, and they don't know what they're going to input, it was quite formal. And Peter and I know each other very well. We're old friends. So we were, I think we were relaxed, but we were quite worried about giving the right thing. And it was called Hop On, Hop Off, because the whole structure was that you could come for, it was every single, not every day, but almost every day through November. And you could hop on, hop off, a bit like going onto a bus. And what you were building was a November to remember. And what emerged during the course of the month was how the teachers in the various countries, who on the whole didn't know each other very well, some of them didn't know anybody else, how what they needed was support. What they needed was personal support. It might have been how you teach the present perfect tense. I mean, it wasn't anything as banal as that, but it might have, the topic of an evening might have looked as being language focused, but in fact what was going on was teachers needing support, finding somebody else who had similar concerns, and kind of bonding together. And what I find interesting about over a year afterwards is a lot of those people have stayed together. They do online sessions and so on, and are hoping to be able to get back to North Devon to meet up at a summer course, maybe this year. So really the fundamental thing, the fundamental thing in April was looking at language and life very much from a people point of view. And I think when people go back to using standard textbooks again, standard course material again, I think this is very, very important. It's something I've mentioned before, that when you open or download a lot of textbooks for language teaching, what you see are dialogues, and they're usually called dialogues, not conversations, produced by characters rather than people. And the temptation for the person, the textbook writer, and for the textbook user, the teacher, is to ignore the people factor and go into the language factor. And this is an example I've used several times. It's from a textbook series that I was involved in fact, for Brazil. And I was lucky because I was there doing some consultancy, and I did a lot of sitting around not taking photographs because I felt that was intrusive, but making a lot of notes about the real language that was being used in real life situations where foreign visitors were communicating with local people. So in hotels, in taxis, in shopping malls, stores, and so on. And on the basis of that, I wrote dialogues which look actually absolutely standard textbook dialogue. Two people in a hotel, in a bar, saying they want to order. The local person, LP is the local person, the Brazilian waiter saying, what do you want? We want to see the menu. And what I'd observed was how the two visitors, and they were both British, how incredibly rude they were to the waiter, who, poor man, was struggling with a very full restaurant area. He looked incredibly tired. They're not real people. They were put in by the publishing company. And the temptation as a teacher would be to focus on the language and forget about the people. And if you go back to the photograph, as I say, they're not the real people, but if you can use the photograph to speculate about the people who are going to produce the language before you ever hear them on the listening material or read it in the text, that can actually help bring language to life. And it's something that, again, I want to come back to, and perhaps if I can come out in September, we could, do some role play and play around with this a bit. But if you think of yourself in your domestic situation, speaking Polish or any other language, how does how you feel affect both what you say and how you say it? And how are you also affected by your feelings towards the other person or people you're dealing with? If you're with somebody you don't like very much, I mean, I know I can be quite abrupt if I'm with somebody I don't like, and I have to remind myself, to be a nice person. So I think bringing the human element into textbook language and remembering the extremes of feeling and emotion that all of us have gone through in the last 2 years, including your students, can help, I think, to bring language to life. So those were my sort of 5 areas worth thinking about. And I'm slightly conscious of time, we're not doing badly. I thought I'd end up with my own personal views of where I've gone from April to now. This is, if it weren't dark, this is what I could show you out of the window that is in front of me. Semi-rural, a small mountain, a large hill, snow, quite typical Scottish landscape. That's what I see when I get up every morning, unless, of course, it being Scotland, the clouds are down and you can't see anything. So that, for the last, I've lived here for 20 years, the last 20 years, that in a sense is my visual context. But for the last 2 years, my work context has been that. It's the computer I'm using at the moment in a horribly messy study, I'm afraid. And for all of us, I think, we've had to come to terms with the change from one physical space to another physical space. And as somebody said at the beginning, Willow, I think, said at the beginning, this can be good, it can be positive, but for some people, it's a challenge. One of the things that were possible in lockdown was to be able to go outside, to work outside. So for a bit of time last spring, that was my working area. There's a river outside the house, and so not this computer, my laptop by the river, and with a glass of wine to keep me going. So that is a working area, but a rather different working area, pluses and minuses. And I said right at the beginning that the place I was in 2 years ago was this place, which is my sort of other home. And it's quite interesting to say Venice. It's a bit like saying Paris to people, because for people who haven't been there, or saying Rio, you know, Copacabana, it's a place for tourists, it's a place you go to have fun. If you've actually lived in a place, my view of that canal, which is near the house where I used to live, is probably very different from a tourist view. And I think if you're looking, if any of you are teaching, and I know a lot of you are, in places as in Calendar where foreign tourists come, it's well worth thinking of ways of helping your students to kind of get under the surface and show different aspects of the place they live in, you live in, to tourists, and think about what really is interesting as opposed to the obvious things like St. Mark's Square in Venice. So almost at the end, these are the references. That is the Lexical Lab website, if you didn't get it from the earlier one. And if you go onto that, all you have to do is sign up to their mailing list, and you'll get a copy of the language document. And I hope I said I did ask Hugh's permission to be able to share that with you. The other material, some of it came from the Teacher magazine in July and September. I've got to write something for February, so I think it'll be project based. And as was said at the beginning, wearing my publishing hat, I published Peter Medgyes' Non-Native Teacher, which some of you will know. I was the original publisher of it, my gosh, I think almost 20 years ago, the first edition. And the one that's around now is basically totally rewritten and done in a much more conversational style than the original one, which was quite didactic. The first one 20 years ago was Medgyes Peter saying this is how it is. The non-native teacher of 2 years ago is Medgyes Peter saying, here's an idea, what do you think of it? Asking questions. And this whole thing of asking questions is something that interests me a lot from a teacher training and a writing point of view, because I think there's a danger sometimes that one can, as a trainer or a writer, you can be giving recipes, you know, here's a good way of doing it, end of story. And again, this is something which I had originally written, I think about 15 years ago for Brazil. When I came to rewrite this with Vinnie Nobre a couple of years ago, we both decided that it shouldn't be Susan and Vinnie saying do this. It should be Susan and Vinnie saying, here's something we think. How does that relate to your experience? How does that fit in with what you want to do? Here are some questions. Think about them. If you're working in a group, if you're in a teachers association, which is obviously the ideal situation, talk about the ideas. But just because somebody says it in a book, you don't have to believe it, but you have to have a good reason for not believing it. So discussion, the thing that if this were a live session, we would have done a lot of, because that's the way I like working. I think discussion and asking questions is really, really important. And as the world gets more complex, as our lives get more complex, I think, you know, the ability to ask questions, to think, to discuss with people is really, really important in any language. And it's a very, very good way of making the foreign language, the other language, open to people and giving them skills. And I thought I would finish with one of my favorite photos. I've used it in the past as a a sort of picture of what I think good language, good teaching is about. I said there was a river by the side of my house, and this was taken a couple of summers ago with 2 swans and 3 little swans, cygnets. And for me, the swans, the adults, are good teachers. They're keeping an eye on the kids. They're not interfering, but they're waiting to see if anything goes wrong. And given the way the world has gone wrong in the last 2 years, I think that's something that we all need to do as people as well as teachers. So that's the climate point to end on. And the future, heaven knows. I very much hope in the near future we can all meet up for real and we can exchange ideas together positively and productively. That's my email address, and I'm very happy to answer questions. Because I'm not traveling at the moment, I'm actually very good at responding to emails. So anybody who's got any questions or comments, don't hesitate to get in touch with me. So, my gosh, spot on time. Thank you very much. And I hope things get better for all of us.
Thank you so much. As usual, you have woken up our positive energy. We all have somewhere at the back of our head, but with all everyday activities, we tend to forget about it. Yes, yeah. And you are one of those people who bring us back to the positive side of our lives.
Good. I'm delighted.
If there is anybody else who would like to say something at the end of this webinar, please turn on your microphones, turn on your cameras, and if you feel like expressing your feelings about the webinar, you are welcome to do so. Anyone?
And don't feel you have to agree. I like a good discussion.
Okay, so since there are no more opinions, just the positive, all the positive ones in the chat box, I am already looking forward to seeing you, meeting you at our conference, hopefully in a real lecture room rather than the virtual one. And in the meantime, we will keep in touch. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for organizing it, and goodbye to you all. Good luck.